panele i diskusije. Danas je to panel diskusija pod nazivom Endgame ili završna, posvećena 25. godišnjici potpisivanja Dejtonskog sporazuma. Ovaj put na diskusiju učestvuju JULIAN BORGER, FLORENCE HARTMAN, David ROHDE, Peter MAASS, a moderira Keulemans. Ovaj program ide online, tako da pozivamo vas da ga pratite i da nakon njega pratite i svečano otvaranje festivala Bookstan u 17 sati koji će se održati ispred na trgu Suzantag ispred Narodnog pozorišta u Sarajevu, gdje će biti održana promocija knjige Zontag u prisustvu autora Benjamina Mossera. Hvala.
I think this is the moment that we take over for a panel discussion about Endgame. I think all of us are heartbroken that we're not in Sarajevo, that we're not at the Bookstan Festival, that we're not at the meeting point. So I did my best to find one place in my Amsterdam house which looks most like the bookshop. And I'm very, very honored, excited to be in this company, even from a long distance. Florence Hartman, JULIAN BORGER, Peter MAASS, David ROHDE, 4 of the sharpest, wisest, most exciting observers and reporters of the Bosnian War in the early 90s. I think all of your work, your books, your publications, your reporting, your campaigning has contributed seriously to the some level of justice and recognition in the state of Bosnia-Herzegovina. So it's a beautiful thing that they have invited you at the opening of the Bookstan Festival to talk 25 years after the genocide in Srebrenica. 25 years after the Dayton Peace Agreements, 75 years after the end of World War II. So the question is, what happens after the end game of wars? Does the peace really start, or do the wars actually never stop? I think we're going to talk about these questions for the next, let's say, 80 minutes. But first, let me introduce you one by one with a personal question. Because I think many people in the audience will be familiar with you and your work, but still. And also I'm curious to know to what extent are you still connected to Bosnia? When was the last time you're here? Florence Hartman, early 90s, you were correspondent for Le Monde in former Yugoslavia. At the beginning of this century, you were the spokeswoman for Carla Del Ponte, the chief prosecutor of the ICTY, the Hague Tribunal. You published books about Milosevic, about Srebrenica, about the wheeling and dealing behind the scenes of the tribunal. When was the last time you were in Sarajevo?
Well, just before the COVID. Mm-hmm. I mean, for this summer I couldn't come because of the situation, but I'm coming every 2 or 3 months, often each years for more than almost 30 years. Yeah.
Good. What brings you?
I'm sad not to be there.
Like we all are. What brings you in these times? Is it reporting, researching, campaigning?
I'm going because I have many friends over there, and it's a story for all of us. I think today, which started at the beginning of our adult life, let's say, and something you cannot completely turn the page. And I'm interested by what is going on. I'm interested by the truth and things you couldn't do till the end while you were reporting the war. Just what you couldn't establish for sure, and fighting against people who like to hide the facts and trying to understand and trying to learn something. And what it's astonishing, it's that's what we were listening to ahead of the war, the discourse of hatred and the separation of people, the designation of people because of their origin and everything is just spreading over in the world. And that's something which makes you also continuing to follow.
We learned, all of us, I think, learned a lot of the patterns we see in the rest of the world today. Have you been to Srebrenica lately?
Not for the last 3 years.
I was there in January to research for a book I was writing about Srebrenica. And it was sad to see the place. It's like a ghost town. It was winter, of course, January. Few people in the streets, but really very empty. And the only place of serious, how do you say, grace, or you might even call it elegance, is the cemetery and the former factory that has been turned into the memorial center. Let's move on. Peter MAASS, you're now the senior editor at The Intercept. 92, 93, you were in Bosnia covering the war for the Washington Post. I remember reading your book, Love Thy Neighbor, shortly after it appeared in 1996. One of the most shocking, memorable, personal, angry, colorful books about war I have ever read. Last year, you came into the picture again, full rage, when the scandalous thing happened that the Nobel Prize for Literature was given to Peter Handke, at which moment you said the Nobel Prize organization is now fully engaged in the business of genocide denial, because Peter Handke, as we know, has done everything he can to obscure what happened in Srebrenica before and after. When was the last time you were in Sarajevo?
It was quite a long time ago. It was, I think it was 1998 when the Bosnian edition of my book was published in Sarajevo by the Festival MAASS. And the only other time I've been back to the former Yugoslavia at all was a year or two later when Milosevic was overthrown. I went to Belgrade to cover that. I haven't been back either to Belgrade or to Bosnia since then. And you know, one of the reasons was I kind of made, I think, a conscious decision to move on from Bosnia. I, became involved in covering the wars that the United States itself was fighting in Afghanistan and in Iraq and elsewhere. Had a family as well, and really thought that my work was done, and done well by a whole generation of journalists, even though the ending wasn't what we would have wanted. It was better than might have been the case if we hadn't, and so many people hadn't made those efforts. But then the Handke Nobel Prize happened. And Peter Handke, as I think all or most of us know, is an Austrian-born writer who in the early parts of his career had some very notable, quite great books. But then in the 1990s, he turned into essentially as a genocide denialist and wrote a series of novels, plays, memoirs, and also made speeches that were basically denied the genocide in Bosnia, excused the violence that had been committed against people in Bosnia by the Serbs. And he spoke at Milosevic's funeral. So when that award was announced, I wrote a very angry opinion piece about it. And then the more I thought about it, the more kind of I became outraged and realized that, and this gets a bit to the theme that we're all going to be talking about perhaps, that the war I had covered that I thought was over, that I thought had been, at least as far as history was concerned, had been settled in terms of genocide and who was responsible, et cetera. It was not settled, that the war that I had covered was still going on in other ways. I was, somewhat oblivious perhaps to things that, had always been there. But that re-engaged me, and I continued to write more about Handke and about, the complicity now of other institutions and people, including the Swedish Academy, the Nobel Prize Organization. And it also turned me into, I'm a senior editor at The Intercept, and I've been, in the position of being able to publish stories by people who bring Bosnian, kind of a Bosnian understanding of history to the readers here. So, Alexander Heyman has written for The Intercept. Edna Bacinovic has written for The Intercept. And just a couple of days ago, Elizabeth Rubin, who covered the war, wrote an amazing piece for us. So I have not yet returned to Bosnia since that first visit, and only visit after the war. I would have gone to Srebrenica. I was planning and hoping to go to Srebrenica in July, but of course the pandemic got in the way.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you're going to visit Banja Luka once the sculpture of Peter Handke is celebrated in the town square, no?
Banja Luka is a place that I, as well as I think other people on this panel and other people listening, spent some time in during the war, and I look forward to going back there to talk to a lot of people there and understand much better what's going on.
You will. Julian Borger, you're currently the World Affairs editor at The Guardian. During the 90s, you covered the Bosnian War for the BBC. 4 years ago, you published The Butcher's Trail, a really spellbinding book covering the 15-year manhunt in which every suspect indicted by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was either tracked down and arrested, gave themselves in, or chose death rather than to be taken alive. Just before this started, you said you haven't been to Bosnia for a few years now. When was the last time you were in Sarajevo?
I think it was 2016. I think when the book came out, and then almost immediately after, I was based in the UK then, and then I was sent out here to the US. I'm just in the outskirts of Washington here, and soon after that, the November election 4 years ago, Donald Trump kind of came into everyone's life and been all-consuming since then. Yes, I was also planning to be in Sarajevo this summer and make a trip of the Bookstan trip, and very sorry not to be there, but grateful to Bookstan to have me on.
Like the other gentlemen on this panel, you're obviously how do you say, obsessively following every development in the US elections. How difficult is it, or how easy is it to bring back the memories of Bosnia and the Bosnian War into this context?
I don't think they ever quite go away, and what Peter was saying is an important point, is that the assault that genocide denial represents means you can't walk away from it. You have to go back as being one of the witnesses and go back and defend it. And I find myself, I have a column on my tweet deck which is all Bosnia, because you feel the horror and the obscenity of denial is something you can't really look away from, and especially having been there at the time, it's not something at a gut level. It's not something that could be tolerated, and not something that you turn your back on. So I feel that the denialism has probably sucked us all back in to some extent, and I think having been there, during the war, you can't come away without a sense of obligation to Sarajevo and to Bosnia, having seen that degree of suffering firsthand to completely ever leave it in the past.
Yeah. I'm struck actually by the way that all of you speak about obligation, responsibility, work as a reason to be there, to report, to move on if you think that your attention needs to be elsewhere, and to return once Bosnia makes it urgent, makes it important, makes it relevant to return. I'm struck by that. David Rode, during the war, you worked for the Christian Science Monitor. You won the '96 Pulitzer Prize for your persistent on-site reporting on the massacre of thousands of Bosnian Muslims in Srebrenica. Your book, Endgame, gave us the title for this afternoon. It's a meticulous reconstruction of the fall of Srebrenica based on deep research and interviews with people from all sides. When was the last time you were in Srebrenica?
I was there 5 years ago. Like others, I planned to go this summer, and the pandemic kept me here in the U.S.
You were there at the 20th commemoration.
Yes, and I noticed, it was very. We've all talked about denialism, and there was denialism there during 5 years ago. In terms of many Serbs have always questioned, what happened. We can talk about that obviously in more detail, but it was growing at that point. It was 2015, and then I'll say I wrote a piece from here about for this anniversary, and I wanted to. There's a passage I just want to read from it because I want to admit kind of the arrogance I felt that I saw propaganda and denialism during war when I covered it decades ago, and I didn't think it, would come to my country, but it has right now, this year. So I should just summarize this, but I wrote in the story, I assumed arrogantly that the United States' democratic institutions, as well as its free press, would reject, expose, and discredit false claims. Instead, in recent years, a willingness to distort basic facts, the rise of partisan media outlets, and the explosion of false information online has made denialism politically profitable in the U.S. So basically say that, with a pandemic here and the protests for racial justice, my country is now the international calamity, not Bosnia. And I think that's a reality we've all faced in recent years here. But anyway, denialism is universal. It's incredibly dangerous anywhere in the world at any time, and it is growing, I think, worldwide.
And this is something you would never have expected to have to say in 2020, I'm sure.
I should have assumed I was wrong. I think we were any different, frankly.
Florence, we're talking about denialism. And I found you say somewhere recently that the Dayton peace agreements, 25 years old, were actually shaped to erase the international betrayal of Srebrenica. Can you explain what you mean there?
Yeah, I think that people in Bosnia know perfectly what I mean. I didn't say that so recently. I'm saying that for long, but I even said it exactly when it happened. But I had to gather information and not just to understand things at one moment, but to establish it, because we had another story. My point was that, in fact, Dayton, that the endgame strategy, which will be finalized in Dayton in November '95, was conceived before the fall of Srebrenica. While, so before the genocide, that's territorial integrity for Bosnia, the internal bipartition of Bosnia along the principle 49-51%, which was already established agreed in 94. But the Western narrative was always designed so that the public opinion would believe that it came after Srebrenica. In face of the genocide, the good Western country, the international community eventually woke up, overcome their divisions, and worked efficiently to pressure Milosevic and bring an end to the war. But it's a nice story, but it appeared that through the archives, and a lot of archives have been available since the last 30 years, in particular since the last 10 years, that the Srebrenica was not abandoned due to the mere stupidity of some individuals in the field, deficient machines, or secret agreement between two generals in the countryside. But by the decision of the big powers. And that's very important. And that was ahead of Mladić's assault. And that's what I was trying to say by that. And
so you mean that the Dayton Agreement itself reflects the ambitions, the wishes of the greater powers which they had already in place before the genocide?
I mean, they wanted to bring an end to the war. Sure. They had some kind of framework, as I said, keep the foreign, keep the integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the internal partition. But then you have to make a map for this partition, and that was difficult. And Srebrenica was the problem. Milosevic had accepted, had agreed to bring the VRS to the 49 portion of the territory, but he wanted a connection of territory with Serbia. So Eastern Bosnia and Srebrenica was the problem, which and for him it was not negotiable. That was the sacrifice of Srebrenica. I don't think that the big power wanted the people to die. All those people who had survived ethnic cleansing, who had found refuge in the enclave, because that was a place where the people who succeed to survive in 92, because the story doesn't start there in 95, had found a refuge. They didn't want them to be killed, but such a sacrifice, the key for peace was a genocide. And it was foreseeable that mass crimes would happen, and that's the problem we have.
Which is also, I think, one of the things that David Rode back then already, through your research, dug up and exposed to the world. It was foreseeable. David, I follow Florence very well on her connection between the Dayton peace agreements and the Srebrenica genocide. But the Dayton agreement was put in place at least to end the war, and from there on to rebuild a country. How did you look at the Dayton agreement back then? Did you see it as a, how do you say, a valuable stepping stone towards some kind of renormalization?
In the short term, it ended the killing. It was finally, there appeared to be a serious bluntly American intervention, where finally American ground troops brought in to enforce the peace, we were all very afraid that there was going to be all this additional violence. The Serbs were going to attack the U.S. troops, and I believe, right, the line that was always used was that there wasn't a single sort of shot fired in a hostility towards any of the NATO troops, and it just made the slowness of that intervention that much more tragic. I was massively, I'm going to do a lot of saying I was wrong today. I was way too optimistic about, Dayton's enforceability, how the country might come together, how the Western involvement disappeared faster than I expected, and the situation now is just tragic and really frustrating to young Bosnians in particular, and I understand why.
Let's move through that development, because Peter, you too, in '98, when you returned for the first time after the war, you wrote in your report about that visit that you were not without hope. You even said, "We are not at history's mercy, we can be the shapers of it." This is a great statement to counter, let's say, the fatalistic people inside and outside of Bosnia. We can be the shapers of the future. At that moment, you looked around you and you saw the roots, or at least the beginnings of some kind of normalization. Can you go back to that time? Dayton was still young. People were working hard to get their life back.
Yeah, this was 1998, and what I did was I went back. My book was being published there, and then I used the occasion to go talk to people who I had encountered during the war. People who had been shot in front of me, people in Visegrad who were responsible for the genocide there, and people who had committed heroic acts in defense of humanity in Bosnia. And so I don't know if that particular visit and those encounters were what kind of gave me hope, as it were, but what I saw was people who were struggling for good and people who were still struggling for bad. And which sounds very basic. It sounds like I'm kind of, writing a book for toddlers here. But the story is kind of basic in that sense. When I wrote in that story, which was for the New Republic, that, we can be the shapers of history, that does not mean we control history. We don't. This is, very clear. But we are protagonists within it, just as there are antagonists within it. And, when I look back on the reporting that was done during the war, obviously it did not reach the people I wanted at the, with the speed that I wanted, with the impact that I wanted. But the reporting that all of us did, the efforts that everybody made, Bosnian fighters, Bosnian civilians, diplomats, good ones at least, had an effect without which things would have been even more disastrous. And so when I look at the present moment, when I look at, what happened, for example, with the elevation of HARTMAN and the elevation of these conspiracy theories, which had been circulating but hadn't been given that platform, I see the struggle continuing, and I see the need for our struggle to continue, because if we don't, then things will be a hell of a lot worse. And they're not. Our struggle isn't going to succeed in the sense of like, we are going to defeat these, terrible ideas or these retrograde forces, et cetera. But we're going to reach an outcome that would be better than it otherwise would be. And without that struggle on our behalf, it would be disaster. Mm-hmm. And so that's my nursery book answer to your question. I'm afraid it's not really terribly complex.
Mm-hmm. No, but it's rich though, and I think you're sharing a lot of mixed feelings. All of us do. Julian, there was you write in your book, there was something that struck you post-Dayton, an almost total absence of reprisals, very little revenge between people, even though they were former neighbors, knew each other. This was striking, and this does this. How do you in hindsight, how do you explain this absence of revenge, of reprisal? I don't
If
know
I'm being honest, I can't. It's hard to, imagine a community having gone through all of that genocide and to be almost zero. I mean, there was, I think there was one incident, or a couple. Is extraordinary, an extraordinary act of, I don't know, spiritual generosity that it continues to amaze me, and I guess that was one of the things that fed a feeling of optimism, that there was, there was a readiness to the implied readiness for reconciliation. And I was just, while the others were talking, I was thinking back to that time and what made me optimistic, I think, at that time was I had this belief that Europe, the European Union, would exert this really powerful gravitational pull. Everyone would want to be part of it. And in order to be part of it, you had to jump through these hoops, and your society had to conform to these parameters and these standards, and that gravitational pull would pull Bosnia in the right direction. So, completely wrong about that. Here I come. I'm a Brit, and we've left the EU. Illiberalism is on the rise. The first real non-democracy has sprung up within the EU in the shape of Hungary, and so that was a source of optimism that has crumbled to some extent. It's not gone completely, but it's not that same source of optimism that it was. And the other source was this belief that generational change will ultimately integrate the country. But that has been stymied by the nationalist parties and governments creating their own ecosystems for the children to grow up in, their own schools, their own reality. And that has foiled the natural instinct, I think, of a new generation coming up and not wanting to bear the burdens of their parents. And I think that, those are two sources of optimism that I had, I think, in late 90s, that have not delivered in terms of Bosnia's future.
Yeah. And this last thing, the lack of generational willingness or ability to restore connections might also have something to do with Dayton again, because it made this system of separate education easier to install than it should have been.
Yes, I mean, but ultimately, if they'd had they had a will to do it, you see the two schools under one roof, the federation. Then, but obviously, Dayton made it easier for nationalist parties to dominate. So ultimately, it is the straitjacket in which Bosnia has been forced to live ever since. And the worst things we're finding in the UK and the US is the self-perpetuating nature of populism, because populists are really good at campaigning and really crap at governing. Under their governance, things tend to get worse, and and education gets worse, and economic conditions get worse, and that in turn feeds more populism. Now we're going to see if that cycle can be broken here in the US on Tuesday, but it is a hard cycle to break.
Yep.
And kind of Bosnia taught us that lesson before it arrived on the shores of the UK and the US.
Right. But that was in a time when we thought we are fine, we are perfect, we're not ever going to be like Bosnia. And we live in different times now. David, I saw you nodding when Julian mentioned this period of hope, when he thought it's only a matter of time before Bosnia will jump through the hoops and be accepted into the EU. You yourself, in the postscript to your book, you said the most important tool for stabilizing Bosnia is the carrot of EU membership. Denying membership to nationalists until they unify the country will succeed over time. The promise of EU membership caused Serbia to finally arrest Karadzic and Mladic, and it will work in Bosnia as well. This is 2011. And I'm not forcing you to say that you were wrong again, but this is not so long ago. And at that moment, you believed the EU would provide the next phase after Dayton.
Yeah, I was there in 2010, and I went to meets that sort of gone on 5-year intervals, and I was, let me say this again, I was wrong. I was too optimistic at that point. And I think what Julian talked about, I mean, the failure of Dayton was that each, the vetoes, the power of each entity to block actions by the other entities, their ability to create their own education systems, their own political patronage systems. Corruption is an enormous problem in all countries, but Bosnia in particular. And I underestimated how powerful that was. And I don't blame the Bosnians. You can hear it, I think, in the way each of us talk. Like the men and women who survived Srebrenica, the massacre survivors who, played dead, and Vlutin Oric, who, lay there completely still for hours under, his cousin's body as the executions were carried out. Who had the courage to sort of tell me what had happened, so it's always been, I've always had a really deep faith in the people of Bosnia. I think the West has sort of failed to empower them. And just again, I was nodding with Julian in terms of, populism is very effective. It's very effective in the US right now. I have no idea who's going to win the election here. And that Julian's absolutely right. Like it does lead to poor governance, but skilled populist politicians use that to their advantage. As problems aren't solved, they vilify, enemies. They vilify the other, and that's exactly what's happening in the U.S. now. So we'll see. I think there's, forces pushing back. I've been so impressed with the work and writing Peter's done since the Nobel Prize was awarded, and we owe it, to audience, to everyone, to keep pushing on this and writing and speaking.
That's a feeling we share here. Florence, it's remarkable, to hear these men who for a long time, who've done such important work. To hear them speak now from countries, from the UK, from the US, that imposed the post-war order on Bosnia from a position of superiority, economical superiority, military superiority, moral superiority. And now they speak about their countries, and I would do the same about mine. In that same, on the same level that we found Bosnia after the war. This is striking, 25 years later.
Yes, it is, but I'm not so surprised in a way that, the Dayton Agreement awarded ethnic cleansing, but it was also a frame which was stabilizing Bosnia by ending the war and the fightings, and it had some components which were which would have helped to produce something for the future. There was, for instance, I mean, there is the bad side of Dayton. It's the bipartition, the perpetuation of the institutions which were established for the purpose of the crimes, which is, I mean, I'm not afraid to name them. They have the same name today, and that was a big problem. But there was also Annex 7. Annex 7 was the most important instrument to restore the situation from before, somehow to thwart the effects of ethnic cleansing, to interrupt them. But this annex, which was key, as I said, was halted very quickly, I think 97, 98. Its implementation, and it has just started to be then implemented. And then in the way they were implemented, it sealed the precedence of ethno-national affiliation over other types of affiliations. And so step by step, it contribute to stop, to decrease the contact between different people. And we just spoke about new generations. They have grown up with no experience. Their fathers had the pre-war experience, and they could make the difference. They don't know. They never heard, and they don't know. And this situation is terrible, because in fact, it's their entrepreneur, those who were behind the war. And the bipartition evolved step by step, and is now de facto a tripartition of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And we are today in a situation of a frozen conflict, meaning that those who want to destroy Bosnia wait for the metastasis that they have inoculated to continue their work until they achieve the goal initially set before starting the war. And the international community, and they are expecting the international community would validate the destruction of Bosnia. And let's be clear, such a decision would amount.
Can you say that again? The international community would?
I mean, they are expecting the international community to give up and to accept the destruction of Bosnia. That's their strategy. The strategy are very clear. It's not that we don't know where they are going, but what do we do with that? I mean, it's very clear that this to accept that it's a failed state, it doesn't work, and people cannot live together, and the whole story, as you know, accepting that would be would amount to taking mass crimes as a criterion of legitimacy for the amputation of a state and an annexion of another one. Is it what we want? I mean, it's just the question we have to answer. How do you figure out what to do with Bosnia? I don't know, but first, on which starting point are we trying to invent something? And this question has not been clearly solved. That's why those strategies are continuing, because you don't say, no, guys, stop, no way. It doesn't work like that. And this situation is such. Will we discuss for years whether Bosnians are the type of nation capable or not to take revenge, or to be very calm, or to reconciliate and everything? That's useless. First, what do we want? Which kind of world do we want? I'm not sure anyone knows, as you said, none in your country or mine or the US, the UK. And we are in a very complicated environment, and that's also give hope to those who didn't finish the destruction of Bosnia in the 90s, that they could reach their initially set goals now, and they are very patient. And what would come in place of Dayton, that's what is at stake. I mean, do we want to reward further crimes against humanity and genocide? Are we capable to say no? And I think that a way to say no, it's, I don't know, something like even before getting Bosnia into the EU, because it's more complicated. It's maybe doing what they did with Montenegro. I know that there is a technical problem, but to get Bosnia into NATO, just to say no. Dayton Agreement, we keep it by in that sense that we don't destroy Bosnia. It's a recognized state, and the border will not change. And NATO would be a kind of protection. That's why those who want to destroy Bosnia are refusing that Bosnia get into NATO. And I don't know. That's
for the people in Bosnia. Probably they know exactly who you're talking about. For the sake of our discussion, could you name a few names when you talk about the people who didn't finish the destruction of Bosnia in the 90s, but are patient and willing to wait until their chance comes?
I mean, it's very clear there was a double aggression, or however you call it, and the ideology and the project, which doesn't mean that it's the whole nation. I'm speaking about the political project, political entrepreneur.
By who?
And you had the project coming from Belgrade with their allies in Bosnia for the partition of Bosnia and to annex a part of the country. And there was also on the Croatian side, who became the allies of Milosevic for the partition of Bosnia. And the idea of the partition of Bosnia is still on the table. And
the people you're talking about are still in positions of power and running the nationalist parties.
Those parties are still here and in power, and they have the same or new leaders, whatever. That's not a problem of name, but I mean, Dodik in Banja Luka and people before him wanted the separation of Republika Srpska, and Republika Srpska is, as I said, the name of the institution which was established for the war and for the crimes. And you have it still, and they are just saying very clearly. I mean, there is not much discussion. They are still saying that they want to finish the job, and I mean,
let me.
I mean, I've been clear enough. But the project is the problem. Whoever is leading the project is the same. The two projects for the partition of Bosnia are still on the table, and they are still ongoing.
Peter, what goes through your mind when you hear of this analysis from Florence? Because at the beginning of our conversation, you said after the war, you moved on to other wars the US were involved in. And you had a kind of confidence that Bosnia would be able to restore itself with help from the international community. Now you're listening to this story by Florence, who points out that those who didn't finish the destruction of the country back then have never stopped working towards that goal. Does this give you the feeling I should not have left my responsibility, should have stayed here?
Well, I don't know if I ever thought the international community would help Bosnia restore its sovereignty. I mean, I think that the experience of that war for myself, at least, was to have to be able to have no faith in what the international community might do, particularly with respect to what the right thing to do would be. So I don't think that was my expectation. I don't think I knew at the time where Bosnia was going. I had hopes, but I saw a struggle, but I had hopes, of course. Dayton has been, handcuffs for the development of Bosnia. And I don't feel, as an American who hasn't been to Bosnia for quite a long time, I don't feel competent, and I don't think there's any good in me kind of talking about internally what is going on in Bosnia, what people there should do. What I would say, which doesn't relate to that, is what it has awakened in me is the awareness of, or it's made me ask myself, what can I do? And what is there a need for? And what I feel, and this is perhaps my own family background. I'm Jewish, come from a Jewish family, so I'm obviously aware of all the particularities and generalities of that. We are now still talking about the Holocaust, and there is Holocaust denial, despite an immense amount of state and individual educational efforts that have just been incredibly extensive. So one of the things that has been done, which is necessary, though no curative, is actually assembling the evidence. Now, there's so many people there we know who are never going to be convinced by the evidence, but assemble the evidence, have it there, have it available. And when I look at Bosnia, I see that the evidence that's been assembled best has been by the ICTY. The court verdicts, the transcripts are incredibly helpful, incredibly authoritative, without getting into a discussion of the shortcomings of those processes. But I'm a journalist, and this is where I see the shortfall. When I want to find something that, well, David, your work is pretty available. The Christian Science Monitor work that you did is easily available now. Guardian Archives, a little bit more difficult, but not so difficult to get to. New York Times Archives, when you go back, you have to pay for it. There is work that is simply unavailable. Samantha Power, when this Nobel thing happened, she had to tweet out a picture of a story she got because she couldn't get the actual story itself. There are so many, Roy Gutman's Pulitzer Prize winning stories on the death camps in northern Bosnia. The only version of them that exists in digital form, as far as I can tell, and I've talked to Roy about this, is a Los Angeles Times version of them that was published, but not the original stories that appeared in Newsday, because that version of Newsday no longer exists. It's just a Long Island version of it. And if you go from country to country, a lot of the articles that were written about what happened were never digitalized. A lot of the articles that were digitalized are no longer available. They're behind paywalls that most of us can't access, and even then, digital archives are incredibly unreliable and spotty. So one of the things that I've mentioned before as a project that I'm trying to get off the ground if I had more time, is that we need to assemble an archive of all of this work so that you don't have to, when you want to find out what happened, what happened in let's go outside of Bosnia, what happened in Vukovar at such and such a time, what happened in Gornji Vakuf, what happened in Srebrenica, what was initially reported about it, all of that. You have to search and here and there, and it's hard to find. This sounds like a very urgent, timely project, at least to counter also the misinformation that is building both in the country and around the world. Julian, for your book, of course, you depended partly on the archive of the ICTY, the Hague Tribunal. You followed that closely, and right now there are talks between the Memorial Center in Potocari
and the how do you say, the people who take care of the legacy of the ICTY to transfer 7 million documents that have been digitalized into a database, to transfer them to Potocari. What do you think about that? To have all the 7 million documents that were collected and researched in Srebrenica itself?
Yeah, I think as a legacy of the court, that is, almost as important as the sentences that are handed down, and that there is, as Peter was saying, there is this mass of documentation of witness statements that can never be erased. And obviously, it's digital. It's symbolic that it will be in Potocari, but also important. The whole mission of the memorial and the court, in a way, is the same. It should not ever be never forget. And that is a powerful legacy of the court, that the detractors of all the politics that went on, and the rulings that they weren't able to come to because of lack of evidence and so on. That is a really important legacy, that that will be something that's never erased. But whereas what our staff, the stuff that we wrote and during the war, can easily be disowned, as we've seen here in the US, as fake news. I think the court has a more resilient reputation than our news outlets.
Mm-hmm. David, go ahead.
I would say, and this is my chance to, Julian, by the way, is a dear, all of you are, but Julian is a dear friend of mine. So I'm worried that the court's reputation isn't that resilient. I think that, we're living in this, I think, an unprecedented age of sort of disinformation or misinformation. I love the web. I'm not calling for somehow trying to limit or censor the web, but it has made denialism, it travels faster and farther online. Any conspiracy theory, you can find in a few keystrokes. And as a journalist, I think we overestimated our credibility, and I think we're not trusted in any country now. And so looking ahead, and whether it's in Bosnia or the UK or the US, I don't know how we deal with this crisis. I think there's a bigger, disinformation crisis in the US than ever been in the country.
But it's
and so I don't know. We just have to rethink.
Because this is a complicated thing. The Bosnian War was, let's say, barely digital. It was mostly undigital.
Analog, yeah.
Analog. Today, of course, elections, wars, everything is totally influenced by mass information and mass disinformation. Is there a way, David, that reporting the research, the documentation that all of you have done could be of value and meaning today, to show the danger of misinformation when war and ethnic cleansing are being executed?
I would hope it would be valuable. My papers and research from when I wrote my book were held up by the Open Society in their archives in Budapest. Those are now, they've been all scanned, and they're going to go to the Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Mm-hmm. So those are kind of firsthand. Those are the original documents I did all my reporting on. But I do think, and I'm kind of wading into a world I don't know well. I just, so I think that helps. I think there's a problem with social media. Like I'll sound like a stodgy old analog journalist here, but when any of us publish books or publish things in our publications, under American law, at least, if we defame someone, if we libel them, we face the possibility of being sued for that. Many people feel the laws are too easy on journalists and we defame people all the time and get away with it, but there is at least a penalty. I have a lawyer, that reads everything that, I edit or write for the New Yorker magazine or for Reuters before this or for the Christian Science Monitor. And so the fact that, and I don't know the answer, but the fact that on social media, that there is, for that Facebook and Twitter and Google, they face no legal liability whatsoever for the publication of completely false conspiracy theories, and nihilism, is a problem. I don't know how to solve that. I think people should be able to post anything they want on the web. There's some ideas about amplification. Should a platform that amplifies something that's like, I'd like to see more like a legal regime where people could be sued somehow and juries would have to be convinced of it. I don't want a government, deciding what is true and what is false, but it's an enormous
But you
problem.
don't want the tech giants to decide what is true and what is false
or break them up. I just, it's a huge problem right now.
Florence, you speak the language. I don't. I don't know if the others do. But you're also able to follow the media, including social media in Bosnia. This, of course, is in Bosnia too, as in our societies, very strong instrument in the misinformation, in the spread of conspiracy theories, in the polarization going on. Can you comment on that?
Well, what I would say, it's not exactly what you expect from me, I guess. It's that I know this kind of situation with the media, and that's the reason why I learned the language from 86 on. And that was the reason why I learned the language. My friends there were speaking English, Spanish, Italian, whatever. I didn't need to learn. I learned because of the disinformation, because of the conspiracy theory. And so how the impact on the people and how they drive the people to become killers. So what's going on today is just, as we said, the continuation of everything. I mean, if we didn't, at the time it was on media under the control of the authorities. We thought that independent media would solve this kind of situation, but we are completely in another world. And I mean, what happened now in the former Yugoslavia, it's completely exactly the same as in your country, my country, and all other countries. And we don't solve the situation by giving access to the people to facts, news, and everything. So I don't know what to say. I mean, nothing special in the former Yugoslav media, although we are interested because we are speaking about what happened in the 90s here, but it's nothing special and it's dramatic.
Last year I spoke to this young school kid from Zaitse, I believe, where the school kids refused to have their classes separated, Bosniak and Croat. They said we should share our school and our classrooms. So he was a campaigner for that. And then afterwards I asked him, where do you look for your news? Where do you look for the facts? Which TV stations or papers or magazines or online platforms? He didn't understand the question. He was 17. He didn't know what I meant by looking for any kind of media that would tell him the facts. He simply said, I check 4 or 5 different ones, and anything that they have in common is probably more or less close to the truth, and I'll accept that. That is the media situation, not just in Bosnia, but anywhere.
But this media situation, it's not important in the sense that the guy would read something else, even bad medias, if the separate schools had not been accepted. And when were they accepted? In the 90s, instead of Annex 7, I spoke about the returnee, it was the OSCE who accept on the request of a crazy nationalist director of a school saying, you know, my kids are fighting in the courtyard and we should separate. And then we go on and we go on. And it's like an algorithm. We just are provided and fitted with what we want to hear, and that's the story which is, and you cannot I mean that's young people and parents and whoever is just reading what they want to hear. You just have to change the set of mind, not separate people by their origin, by their whatever, which is going on everywhere in the world.
Again, going back to what kind of country, what kind of culture do we want actually to begin with? Now, this would normally be a moment that I would look into the audience and check if there are people with questions for the final, let's say 10, 15 minutes of this panel. I have no idea if people have been able to ask questions in the chat, on the Facebook. Is there anybody from the organization who can inform us about that? Maybe there's people in the meeting point who are watching us live and want to ask something.
This is a great idea, Chris. I'm willing to wait. I want.
Yeah, Leila is telling me there are no questions. Leila, do you mean there are no questions, or there should be no questions?
Both.
Okay, it's funny, huh, to know. There's probably a lot of people out there, but we don't know what they're thinking. Oh, Leila sends us a smiley and says that people have no questions, which is puzzling to me. I have one more question to all of you after this talk. So the question we started with was, what happens after the end game of a war? Does the peace start, or does the war actually never stop? And I think even notwithstanding some moments of hope, I think most of you have said, well, actually the war has never stopped. It goes on in different ways. Peter said, Florence said, those who didn't finish the project, the destruction of Bosnia, are patient and still working on it. David and Julian recognize patterns of misinformation and polarization we see in our countries today, and we saw back then, still at work also in Bosnia. What does this tell us about the nature of war? It's a big question. But all of you have been in the war 25 years ago. All of you have followed it throughout the decades. All of you now come to the conclusion that the war was never really ended. It resurfaces in different ways. So what does this tell us about war? Who would like to go first?
Well, I'll jump in with a quick thought because it immediately brought to mind the title of an amazing book about Vietnam that was written not too long ago by Viet Thanh Nguyen called Nothing Ever Dies. Vietnam, I'm just looking here, I don't want to get the title exactly right. Nothing Ever Dies, which is the part of the title that I remember, Vietnam and the Memory of War. It's an amazing book, but the point that I make in citing the title of it, Nothing Ever Dies, is that, I mean, I guess we're talking most immediately about the Bosnian War of the early 1990s. If we're talking about America, we're talking about what's been going on under Trump in the last couple of years. But, you know, there was a revolutionary war in America a couple of years ago, a couple of centuries ago. And the echoes of it are felt today and are animating with respect to the racism, lots of the violence, the undercurrents of what's happening in America. So none of this is new. We may not know it, but we're always involved in war and struggle in some ways, and we're always fighting the same wars. You know, we have to be engaged in it. And so that's another kind of general banal observation by myself. But there is no time that is not a time of war.
Julian, thank you, Peter. Thank you for this. Julian, you in the book, The Butcher's Trail, you reach a moment which looked sort of final. All the 161 indicted war criminals had somehow been brought to justice or died, or so that looked like one measurable stage in the whole history post-war. But now we're looking at a situation where war in different shapes keeps on resurfacing. Nothing ever dies, as Peter says. What do you think? What have you learned?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Peter said. I mean, covering this election and covering U.S. politics, how alive the U.S. Civil War is, and you know they're still fighting it. It's the front line now is, do they take down the statues and taking down the stars and bars, the Confederate flag? You know, these are the aftermath of a war from more than a century ago. And what's it tell us? It tells us about the importance of myth. The myth that was made about the Confederacy and the rebel cause, the lost cause, this myth making, and maybe what it tells us is there has to be maybe a really determined bottom up and top down attempt to resist that. And I'm thinking about Germany, how Germany in the aftermath of the war really hammered it into the DNA of the German society, a sense of remorse, of never again. And it was a big ongoing project. Mm-hmm. It needs something with that kind of energy to push back against the lost cause myth, you know, which you could say that the Republika Srpska is another variant of the Confederate lost cause myth, you know, the romanticization of genocide. Mm-hmm. Maybe, you know, the lesson of Germany is a useful one in that you have to push back aggressively, and over the years it has to be hammered into the education system, and it's not easy. And even now you've got,
and we might just have lost 25 years to begin with. Florence, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I agree with what was said, and that's the situation, post-war situation, and it's complicated and everything. But here, the main problem we have, or the additional problem we have, it's the ideology behind the war and the crimes people committed, which has not been defeated. So we are that's the key thing. And it would happen in the same, I mean, it would be maybe even worse in other places. But I mean, I don't want to make parallel because I can guess what will be in the social media in Bosnia, wherever, if I say that, but let's go, never mind. I mean, if you had not defeated the Nazi ideology, you couldn't have reconciliation in Europe. It's simple like that. And that ideology is still present. It's what I said in another way earlier today. And that's it. And this ideology, it's an ideology which is spreading in other places now, in other contexts. It's an ideology which was condemned by a legal qualification, for instance, at the tribunal. It brought crimes against humanity, genocide, and things like that. Although during the trials, the ideology was not condemned legally. That's a problem, and the big difference with Nuremberg. But now it's even getting fans over the world. You have Breivik for Utoya. You have people in New Zealand who are quoting people who were behind and the mastermind and the architects of those mass crimes in Bosnia. And that's a big problem. And you cannot have a reconciliation in a country, and you cannot have even hope of normal relation between different groups of people and ethnic or religious groups over Europe if you don't defeat it over there and everywhere else.
Yeah. So if an ideology, evil ideology, is not defeated and followed by an offensive, it will pop up and start spreading and inspiring other people across the globe. David, you're last.
I agree with everyone, and I think that maybe these ideologies have become more subtle in how they express themselves, and that the nature of sort of conflict and war has changed, where there's very much sort of an information war that's going on. And we all, you know, another basic thing, but in a sense, we were all foreigners who profited from the war, you know, the ghouls, the jackals of the press. And so we all, and I kind of applaud, you know, Florence and Peter and Julian for the work they've continued to do. We all have to we have a duty to keep fighting this fight, but we need to do it with Bosnians. You know, Florence speaks the language. I do not. You know, I'm, you know, going back every 5 years is not enough. I would just offer, I don't even know if anyone cares, but I mean, if there's any young Bosnian journalists or researchers, I would love to talk to them. Not that there's anything of great value, but those files and notebooks I mentioned are all in the possession of Elma Hashimbegovic, who's the director of the History Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it's the new generation of Bosnians that are going to write a new history for that country, that are going to that are going to fight those narratives and define their history. And I want to help them. If you're listening to me, I don't have the answers. They have the answers, but I can tell them what I saw many years ago and what is the truth. We were on the ground. Peter wrote this beautifully, like we saw what happened. And it's frustrating and wrong that there's now an information warfare to call all of us liars. So I stand by my reporting from so many years ago and hope to help another generation continue the fight.
Thank you, David. Liars, you are not. Certainly not. I'm impressed by the sense of commitment, sense of responsibility, the generosity, the eloquence. I think this means that all of us have not let Bosnia go, will not let Bosnia go. And yes, we will support the new generations to come up with a narrative that guides the country through this period. Nothing ever dies. the war never really stops. But it's not back yet in full fury. It's not too late. I want to thank Florence, Peter, Julian, David very much. I want to thank everybody who was out there. I congratulate Bookstan Festival. I know that the grand opening will take place now at the Susan Sontag Square in front of the National Theatre with Benjamin Moser, the author of her recent biography. So enjoy Bookstan after this. Thank you very much for now.
Thank you.